I'm afraid the good times are over.
Well, much appreciated.
This was the end. Oh, no, that's it. Okay.
Time to suffer.
Right. No. It's been a very rich discussion so far. I hugely appreciate the willingness of people to abide by the 15-minute time limit, and I will hand it over now to the next panel.
Great. Thank you very much, Philip, for that warmish introduction. And also for bringing us here. And thank you to Philip and Sally and Lauren for this convening. And it's such an honor to be here with so many people that I've read and learned from over the years, and frequently cited, of course. So I am going to talk about global goals, and especially on health and how they're developed and measured, and why we're failing to reach some of them. I think the intellectual debt to Sally will be very evident. And I'm going to be a little bit provocative because you've still got a couple more sessions to go before lunch, and I want to give you something hopefully to talk about during lunch. So we're going to start with someone almost as influential as Sally, Plato. Plato's Republic describes a conversation between Socrates and his friends about what would be the nature of an ideal state. And one of the things they talk about is Socrates' suggestion that the ideal republic is going to need a single unifying legend, what he calls a noble lie, that inspires peaceful cooperation and self-sacrifice among citizens despite the reality of widespread inequality. So today we don't have a single unifying legend. Instead, we have numbers, we have indicators, specifically the Sustainable Development Goals, approved by the UN General Assembly in 2016 and intended to mobilize global progress towards a set of ideal sustainable development. Even though we know, in fact, that inequality is widespread. Philip frequently reminds us that this is the case. The SDGs are not a lie, of course, in any malicious sense. They're motivated by the most benevolent intentions. The motivations are positive. But when we look at the SDG on health, without which I would argue we really can't attain any of the other goals, we're really way off track. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the goals, but more about the mathematical models that were used to set the targets and some of the assumptions behind them, because the targets themselves are a sort of narrative, and I'd argue the mathematical models are also kind of storytelling devices. And I think there's a lot of space to interrogate both the targets for health, the mathematical models, the assumptions behind them, and maybe more broadly, the process of creating global strategies. What does it mean to create a strategy, and the widespread nature of strategic thinking and how common it is. In fact, my current occupation, I'm employed part-time by the Global Health Center at the Graduate Institute to create a new strategy for them, which is something every institution now needs to have. So I want to think a little bit about that as well. And I am shamelessly plugging my forthcoming book, The Uncounted: Politics of Data and Global Health, which was started here at NYU in my 3 years here as a visiting fellow. So it was really very much incubated here and very much shaped by my conversations with Sally, with Meg Satterthwaite, and others here. And the book explores data, human rights, and decision-making and global financing for HIV, the increase in indicator and data-driven decision-making and priority setting, and how political and economic forces are shaping the selection and construction of indicators and the data used to report against them at the local level, at the national level, and at global levels as well. So the book draws on analysis of global policies, budgets, indicators, also on ethnographic fieldwork with a community that were trying to change this dynamic by gathering their own data for HIV, and on my experience working as a consultant for civil society activists serving on the boards of global health agencies in Geneva. So I'm interested to think also a little bit critically about the role of donors in constructing indicators and data and in setting priorities. And I'm thinking now of the big donors, the bilateral agencies, such as the US, UK, European Union, and others, as well as agencies like the Global Fund, the Gates Foundation, and beyond. I'm also interested in thinking about the slipperiness of indicators, the places where there are openings for contest and interrogation, the fixedness of what they appear to represent. So to begin with, the SDG 3 on health includes a target on ending HIV by 2030. So what do we mean by end? This is a very sexy term, but there's not a lot of clarity about what it represents. So what it means is that there's scientific evidence that shows that while we cannot eliminate or eradicate HIV, because there's no cure, we can bring it under control. We can reduce and eliminate it as a public health threat through access to treatment, antiretroviral treatment. And so these are on the right here, 90-90-90, the fast-track targets, or some of the most important of the fast-track targets, created by the joint UN program on HIV and AIDS, UNAIDS, which is the agency that coordinates the global HIV response. So the targets they set were 90% of people who are estimated globally to be living with HIV should be tested and know their status. 90% of those who test positive should immediately initiate antiretroviral treatment. And 90% of those on treatment should stay on treatment long enough to eliminate the virus in their bloodstream. So when the virus is undetectable in your bloodstream, you cannot transmit HIV to others. The idea is if we could achieve these 90-90-90 targets, we could achieve global AIDS control by 2030. So these were targets set, these targets were for 2020, so they're for next year. They were approved by the UN General Assembly, and they were very appealing to donors. So US, UK, Gates, and others are suffering from profound AIDS fatigue after decades of financing global HIV response, a very expensive endeavor, and really looking, I would argue, for an exit strategy. And this offers an exit strategy for donors. But as we see now, even though countries have been racing to reach 90-90-90, they're off track. UNAIDS is already warning us that we're not going to achieve these targets by next year. And they are arguing, when you press them, as I have, that the targets were good, the targets were plausible. It was the countries that failed, due to lack of political will, lack of investments. And I think there's some truth to that. It's not entirely implausible. But I also think there's a lot of room to look critically at the targets and at the models that were used to create them. So briefly, UNAIDS used infectious disease models to set the 90-90-90 targets. And the mathematical modeling that they used, this was a relatively new approach to setting targets in 2015. It's now widespread in global health governance. And to create one of these models, you combine a set of assumptions, data, and what we already know about how the rates of infectious disease transmission. So this model here was commissioned by UNAIDS in 2015, and it shows two scenarios in one slide. It shows the red dots depict the future of the epidemic at the levels of treatment coverage that existed in 2016, in which you see a steady rise in HIV infection. And the blue dots show the more optimistic scenario. What happened if you scaled up to 90-90-90? You have this cliff drop in HIV infections. And towards the end of that slide there, you see HIV becoming a much more low prevalence epidemic. So the UNAIDS model was created in 2015. It was very much based on an emerging consensus, based on a variety of other academic models, the most famous of which was one by Ruben Granich and colleagues, in which they modeled universal voluntary HIV testing for everyone over the age of 15, with immediate access to treatment. And what they found is that this approach, universal test and treat, would result in coverage of treatment of 90% by 2016. And all the way over on the right under the green bar up here, you can see this sharp, the cliff drop in infections, a phase change that would bring HIV under control. So the Granich model then spawned a whole bunch of other models, and there was a lot of debate, but essentially there was a consensus that this was feasible, which then resulted in the production of the UNAIDS model on the left. But I'm going to argue that there were three assumptions that were flawed behind the models, three things that were missed. First, and most importantly, I think, models like the one produced by Granich did not take into account the significant human rights and legal barriers to accessing antiretroviral treatment that would be scaled up. So for instance, they assume that you can get everyone over the age of 15 to test for HIV, but in fact, in many countries, age of consent laws mean you cannot test for HIV below the age of 18. And young people are some of the people who are most affected, most vulnerable to HIV. And it also doesn't take into account widespread and extensively documented health sector discrimination against people living with HIV. Study after study, including things done by community groups, by Human Rights Watch, by numerous organizations, including UN agencies, have shown that hospitals and clinics engage in widespread discrimination, imposing extra fees for treatment for people living with HIV, putting some in forced isolation, treating others with stigma and disrespect, and sometimes even actually just refusing to care for people due to stigma and fear. So Granich, to his credit, did mention that there might be some human rights concerns with universal testing for all people over the age of 15. And he said that this would be addressed through, quote, appropriate training, engagement with community, and supervision. But those are programmatic interventions that would need to be funded and that would also need to be modeled. And they are not quantified in the study. It's just a passing reference. So that was the first omission. And the second omission is a much more complex set of problems that I think really jeopardize these hyper-optimistic models that relate to key populations. So that's sex workers, men who have sex with men, transgender people, people who inject drugs. So there are numerous mathematical models that show the positive impact of scaling up HIV testing and prevention interventions among key populations, but that do not mention that many countries criminalize key populations, and that in many countries those populations are in hiding because of fear of arrest. So for example, South Africa, one of the countries with highest HIV prevalence in the world, sex work is criminalized. Police use condoms as evidence when making arrests of sex workers. And so many sex workers are reluctant to carry and use condoms. So you could scale up condoms all you like. That doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to be carried and used by sex workers in South Africa. Similarly, Nigeria, another one of the countries with highest HIV prevalence, highest numbers of people living with HIV, their laws criminalizing same-sex sexuality have been shown quantitatively to result in increased avoidance of health care by men who have sex with men. So they're also scaling up prevention interventions, and treatment interventions are not going to necessarily reach those men who have sex with men who are avoiding healthcare services. So the models, and I'm kind of going through this because I'm very sensitive of the time restraints, but I'm happy to discuss more later. The models have emphasized purely biomedical scale-up, but they're omitting all of these complex factors. It makes it look like all you need to do is procure commodities in order to achieve that cliff drop in HIV infections, and it leaves the difficult realities out. So the models didn't address discrimination against people living with HIV. They didn't address the problems created by criminalization that would make reaching 90-90-90 difficult. And then the third issue that they don't address is the problems with funding. Because the models were created at a moment when we were at a peak of global financing for HIV, and an unspoken assumption in the models is that that funding would continue or potentially even increase in order to facilitate global scale-up. But instead, what has happened is that funding has leveled off and even dropped. And this is because of what I mentioned earlier, AIDS fatigue among donors, competing demands for overseas development aid, including the refugee crisis, climate change, and more. So the money available for global HIV funding is just not enough to reach 90-90-90 everywhere, and donors are left with a problem: how to prioritize. And here I think we who have worked in the human rights world have some work to do to better articulate prioritization principles in economic and social rights, because donors left to themselves have been doing it based on fairly rudimentary indicators. So this is a map created by PEPFAR, which is the US government HIV financing agency run out of the State Department. It's the largest international financing agency for HIV. I'm using them as an example because they're a big target, but there are many other donors facing the same kinds of problems and the same debates. So this is a map of the world according to PEPFAR. It shows countries shaped according to the numbers of people living with HIV in the countries. And so the map shows sub-Saharan Africa is extremely large because of the large number of people living with HIV there. But as you can see, Eastern Europe and Central Asia, Latin America, Asia Pacific are tiny, practically invisible on this map. And PEPFAR has been using numbers of people living with HIV and country economic capacity to decide where they're going to focus their investment. So they've been focusing their money on the countries with large numbers of people living with HIV and low national income, especially sub-Saharan Africa. And many other donors are taking a similar approach, pulling money out of Eastern Europe and Central Asia, out of Asia, out of Central America, and scaling up their funding in Africa. And this is a perfectly legitimate choice to make, but the problem is that in Eastern Europe and Central Asia and other countries where donors have transitioned out, epidemics are concentrated in key populations, drug users, sex workers, and others, who are not a priority for those countries. Governments deny sometimes that they even exist, or say that the populations are so small they don't justify taking money away from other health services. They're reluctant to fund programs that reach those populations. And in fact, there's a data paradox in which government denial reinforces the lack of data, because then there's no efforts to gather the data, people are in hiding, and so therefore you just wind up with this catch-22 in which there's no data to justify prioritization. So the results, and this is from a couple of years ago, it's gotten worse since then. On the right, the blue or blue-green line spiking up is the spike in HIV infections in Eastern Europe and Central Asia as a result of donors pulling out, of governments' lack of prioritization, of the hidden and stigmatized nature of key populations, especially people who inject drugs. We're seeing truly alarmingly high rates of HIV infections. And this is an important part of why we are not reaching 90-90-90. It's the failure of models and the plans to take into account human rights issues and lack of resources. Donors have to make difficult decisions, And they're trying to reach the optimistic scenarios that were predicted in the models by throwing everything they can at countries with high HIV prevalence. So the SDGs gave us a noble lie. I'm arguing a hopeful utopian vision of HIV, ending HIV with no one left behind. But it's a story that's troubled by ignoble truths, persistent inequality, discrimination, marginalization, and lack of financing. Crucial pieces of the real world are being left out in order to construct models and targets that are persuasive and ambitious. But the omission of some of those things helps to construct priorities, such as procurement of commodities, procurement of medicines, without addressing the underlying legal and human rights environment. And of course, leaving things out of a process is part of the process of creating a strategy. When you create a strategy, you have to figure out where you can have an impact, where your unique added value is, where your strengths and weaknesses and opportunities and threats are. You have to choose to focus on some things and eliminate and ignore other things. And so that's why I'm starting to wonder if it's time for us to have a little bit of a critical engagement with strategy, the concept of creating a strategy. Because Sally led us to do an ethnography of indicators, but what are the processes through which strategies are developed, global goals are set? Who's in the room? What political and economic forces shape the priorities in global strategies like 90-90-90 or the SDGs? Can we think critically about the construction of these strategies and about the processes in which they're created? These are, strategic thinking is very much adopted from the private sector. Is it really a good fit for development? And how do we ensure that human rights are upheld and protected in our strategic thinking? So I hope you have answers for those questions. I look forward to discussing them later. Thank you.
Looking for my presentation here. Can you help me find mine?
Sorry about that. Which one? Was it one of these?
The last one to the right.
There you go.
Okay. Well, thank you to Philip and Sally for the invitation. In preparing for this talk, I realized how Festschrifts are mostly about time, right? So both the 15-minute limit and also going back in time to realize when one met the person who's being honored and what that meant to one's own personal and professional trajectory. And I do remember the first time that I met Sally. It was at a Law and Society meeting. I was finishing up a PhD in sociology, was editing a volume with Boaventura Santos, Law and Globalization from Below. I was clearly the senior, the junior, the very junior member of that co-editorial partnership. And Sally approached me in one of those receptions at the Law and Society Association. And what I remember is two things. First, that she talked to me, because in that pecking order, of course, you're the lumpen proletariat of the academic world. So you're not supposed to be approached by a star in the field. Second thing is that the compliment that she gave me, because she had read the manuscript because it was going to be published in her book series, is your chapter is very clear. And I said, so your writing is clear. And I said, to this day, I'm trying to figure out whether that was, well, first it was a compliment, but whether that said anything about the content. Or whether that was just a comparison with Boas' continental philosophy style of writing. But I, ever since, have taken as a point of pride to try to be clear in what I write. Let's see if that works also in what I say. I can't promise anything, but I thought that for today I would use this metaphor of this trope of time to give you a sense of a project that I've been working on for 10 years on indigenous people's rights, human rights, and now the climate crisis. And the reason why I allude to this decade-long period is because it really started with in places like this one, which I call Urra, in 2009. And I started my capacity as a human rights advocate. This is the site of a large dam in northern Colombia, right in the middle of paramilitary right-wing, very violent zone of the country. It was in Urra that I first encountered the idea and the concept, the phrase of prior consultation, FPIC, Free Prior and Informed Consultation, which was the institution that the leaders of the community were using to push back against the expansion of the dam, based on the argument that they had not been properly consulted by the Colombian government, as ILO Convention 169 and the Colombian Constitution mandated. They used prior consultation. They said prior consultation in Spanish, and all the legal terms would be used in Spanish as opposed to their native language, which already kind of showed the process of vernacularization of national legal frameworks and international legal frameworks at the local level. But then I continued to work this time as a researcher in other places in Latin America in which indigenous peoples were waging similar struggles. This is the Belomonte Dam, large dam built in 2011 by the Workers' Party government. I was there a couple of weeks ago, again as the last bit of this decade-old project, now with some clinic students here at NYU. And this also was a story of contestation around large development projects that hinged crucially on the use of FPIC as the key legal instrument to contest extractive capitalism, basically, and the plan for the Amazon that the Brazilian governments from the left and the right have had for 50 years now, since the latest dictatorship. You may know about this because this was the inspiration for Avatar, James Cameron's movie, and here's James Cameron, actually, with Raoni, the well-known indigenous leader. He's now Raoni, 89, and he just toured Europe as part of the campaign against the Amazon fires. And I'll make the rest of the story shorter. The last case study, this has become a book that I co-authored with a JSD student here at NYU, Carlos Vaquero, on socio-environmental struggles and prior consultation in Latin American social minefields. I don't have time to explain what social minefields mean in this context. I wrote an article with that title if you're interested. But the Sarayaku people of the Amazonian Ecuador waged the most successful campaign, both on the legal and the political fronts, against oil extraction in the Amazon. They went all the way up to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, won a key case in 2012. I was there right before the judgment of the Inter-American Court came down. And what's important for the purposes of this presentation and the argument that I want to make about vernacularization is that all of these peoples in very different places in Latin America were using very similar language, right? So this could be told, and we partly tell it in the book manuscript, as a classic story of vernacularization, right? Same global framework, ILO Convention 169, adopted through a wave of constitutional reforms or new constitutions in Latin America in the late 1980s through the 1990s. And the language is all basically the same. Basically, ILO Convention 169 was replicated. The key clauses in the ILO Convention 169 were replicated in one country after another in this constitutional reform wave of the 1990s. And there's more, Guatemala, Peru, and so on. What I want to argue here, and this is kind of the additional step I want to take in the paper for the book in honor of Sally, is to argue that this captures only half of the story, right? That vernacularization is only half of the process whereby international laws are made and remade. And this, I'm going to stop here because I think this bears on the type of future of human rights debates that Mark was alluding to. Most of the very exciting and influential literature on vernacularization have been about looking at how international norms land and are appropriated at the local level, which is why the concept is so helpful and so nuanced in terms of helping us understand why the same norms on women's rights or indigenous people's rights look very differently in different places as they are appropriated, applied, adopted, and adopted by local communities. That certainly has happened with indigenous peoples in all of these places and throughout Latin America. But they also have reshaped, reinterpreted, and re-exported the idea of FPIC. And this is the other half of the story that I want to highlight. And I want to highlight because of empirical reasons, this is happening. So, and that needs to be documented on a par with the north-south traveling of the norms. And I want to highlight it also because we now know through the work of scholars like Sam Moyn that there's this tendency of reinterpreting history as if human rights had been imposed from the north on the south. So I'm pretty sure that in 10 years' time, a student on Sam Moyn will tell the story of indigenous people's rights and FPIC as if it had been an institution that was created in Geneva or in the US and imposed on Latin America, whereas the real story, this half of the story, entails people like the Sarayaku movement or the Urrá leaders or the Belo Monte leaders having interpreted those norms in ways that are a lot clearly more radical and more expansionary than the ILO ever imagined. To the point that FPIC in many of these places, as many of you know, no longer stands for free, prior, and informed consultation, but free, prior, and informed consent. The idea of consent is nowhere to be found in ILO Convention 169. It is there in some exceptional clauses in the UN Declaration on Indigenous Peoples' Rights. But the notion now that there are some ecosystems that are off limits, right? That now scientists like E.O. Wilson in his half-Earth hypothesis or thesis, or the Fridays for Future or movement, or 350.org, the more like that, the climate action movements are making in terms of arguing that in order for the climate system to have any chance of avoiding the more catastrophic scenarios of 1.5 to and above degrees of global warming, these places like the Sarayaku territory or the Belo Monte Dam territory or Urrá territory need to be kept intact, basically. The forests in those places need to be kept intact. Those resources, oil, minerals, need to be kept underground if we're to survive the climate catastrophe. Well, that in social movement literature is called frame bridging, right? So it is a connection and an appropriation of an idea, meaning veto power over extraction in those territories by other social movements in ways that resonate strongly with constituencies around the world. But in order for that process to happen, it had to go down to the level of southern indigenous movements and then re-articulated back into discourses and movements that have a greater presence in the global north. I'll give you just a sense, an empirical sense of how this looks like in my last few minutes. The reason why I argue that this is important also in terms of the politics of knowledge production is because it is already happening that if you see, for example, some coverage, media coverage of the Standing Rock struggle in just a few years ago here in the US. There's a great movie called Awakening that starts with the line, something along the lines, this is the awakening of indigenous peoples around the world. No, it's not. It's not the awakening of indigenous peoples around the world. So this erasure of 20 years of mobilization around FPIC that gets exported, and actually Sarayaku leaders were in Standing Rock in this freezing cold in Minnesota, in North Dakota in January or February. I don't know how they survived that, but there's pictures of Sarayaku leaders standing with the Standing Rock leaders and making the same arguments that they have been making for many years. 20 years saying this is off limits, indigenous peoples need to have a right to veto, right to consent to oil extraction in their territories. And it was through the process, and I'll end, I had, as you can tell here, much more. But this is the one that I wanted to keep, as you can. This is one of the leaders of the Sarayaku movement, Patricia Gualinga, who in 2015 led this really smart, politically smart, savvy mobilization. The Sarayaku people built this canoe in the Amazon, find a way to ship it all the way to Paris during the COP, the COP 2015. And then this is her rowing on the Seine, on the Seine River, right? So this is exactly what I mean by the process. And this is 15 years after they started mobilizing, before the courts, national and international courts, before public opinion, through the media campaign that they launched around the world that got the Ecuadorian government to back off from their territory and not exploit oil or drill for oil in their territory. And this, to me, is the visual marriage connection between the indigenous people's rights framework and the struggle and the climate change mobilization that, of course, now is, and with this we'll end, with the fires in the Amazon. This has become a very visible and clear and explicit connection, to the point that the very hopeful mobilization of young people around the world has seized on some of these themes, on some of these tropes. Some sympathetic critics of the youth movement, like Naomi Klein, said that, well, it took European white kids to make this visible, but probably in a way that indigenous peoples by themselves would not have been able to make as visible. But on the other hand, more pragmatically, and this is my activist half speaking, this is coalition making, and this is how frame resonance and frame bridging happens. But in order for that to be understood, and in order for it to be recognized, we need to understand the other half of the vernacularization process. Thank you.
So I'm Jack Snyder. I'm a political scientist in the room, and I'm very grateful that I was invited, because I always learn when I talk to anthropologists. I had a lot of opportunity to learn from Sally. We were on a conference panel together on human rights. And I learned so much from her so fast that I quickly decided that this was someone whose talents needed to be exploited. So we signed up Sally to write a chapter on vernacularization for a volume that we were doing on human rights futures. One of the main themes of that book, which also has a chapter in it by Beth Simmons, who you'll be hearing from momentarily. One of the themes of the book was the downside of mainstream human rights persuasion strategies. First of all, because in many cultural contexts, they could come off as alien, for being Western, legalistic, and for shaming entrenched local practices under the banner of universalism, and consequently are often not fully persuasive, but also for being downright provocative. Naming and shaming is the go-to strategy of much human rights activism, and it can very easily threaten powerful spoilers in cultures around the world, religious and cultural elites, various kinds of exploiters, whether you call them the patriarchy or dominant cultural groups, or the bosses in society. Human rights shaming is a threat that can provoke a backlash. It can lead to the mobilization of resistance against human rights around powerful cultural themes that these kinds of elites and dominant groups can mobilize. And it can, in some cases, lock in the mobilization and institutionalization of illiberalism. One of the more dramatic instances of this in recent years was when Kenyatta and Ruto got themselves elected president and vice president of Kenya, campaigning against the imperialism of the International Criminal Court and convincing their own respective ethnic groups that electing them, despite having presided over ethnic cleansing of each other's ethnic group, that the only way to protect their respective ethnic groups was to vote for them rather in defiance of the International Criminal Court. So one antidote to these risks of mainstream human rights advocacy practices, as Sally points out, is to promote human rights by translating it into the vernacular of the culture. Sally herself, however, points out that there are costs of vernacularization and translation of this kind. She notes that this has the danger of watering down the human rights message. This can happen in many ways, but one that you commonly hear discussed is, oh, maybe we should promote rights by talking about duties rather than rights, because religions often like to talk about people's duties. But of course, rights are something you insist on, whereas a duty is something that leaves the agency to the discretion of the person who you would like to see recognize their duties. It's a weakening of the demand. Another way that vernacularization can water down the message, and this is something that Sally herself talks about quite a bit, is that you can make just common sense appeals to justice or fairness that are not necessarily embedded in any formal normative system like a local religion, but that might be persuasive in a common sense basis. For example, working with abused women and encouraging themselves to stand up for themselves within their own family. One of the problems whereby this is a watering down of the more generalized human rights message is that these kind of common sense appeals are very specific to the case at hand, which is their strength. They're vivid and tangible and make sense on a kind of immediate emotional basis. But they don't generalize to a larger program. They don't link up to the full range of the Human Rights Project. So there's a great passage in Aryeh Nayer's book about the history of the human rights movement, where he talks about universalization of the message And he goes back through human rights history and he says, you know, there were plenty of times in history where people mobilized for particular projects, whether it was anti-slavery or whether it was the Bulgarian atrocities in the Midlothian campaign of Gladstone, but they didn't generalize to a whole project and a whole set of issues that they linked together in a universalizing ideology. And therefore, the energy would peter out after the individual campaign. And you need to universalize to keep the message constantly on the front burner and sustain the organized network. So I want to mention a couple of other alternatives to that kind of vernacularization that waters down. A couple of alternatives that also water down, but do so differently. One alternative is persuasion by science. We just heard Miriam in the earlier panel talk about medicalization as a way to persuade people to get on board progressive reforms. And so we know that in like women's health issues, promoting scientific persuasion and a medical frame can often convince people that that scientific claim coming from authoritative people from the knowledgeable, scientized West can be persuasive to change people's understanding of health consequences. But we also know that sometimes that doesn't get people to change their behavior, or sometimes it gets them to change their behavior only in medicalizing a version of the abuse, as in the medicalization of FGM. So this is watering down, which comes at a cost that needs to be weighed. Another kind of localization that might not so immediately come to mind is persuasion by bargaining, or to put differently, persuasion by some kind of exchange of valued concessions by both sides. One could argue that in almost all cultures there's a notion of bargaining or exchange of values on a pragmatic basis. Now, exactly how you're supposed to bargain and what exchange of values is supposed to look like is going to vary by cultures and be culturally defined. Nonetheless, I think bargaining is something that is more culturally neutral and that can be a basis of discussion across cultures in a way that is more respectful of the kind of validity of the identity and autonomy of each side to the bargain than, say, shaming people for their embedded practices. So what kinds of bargains am I thinking about? The maybe tacit bargain of, I'll give you a health clinic for your community, and you'll give me the right to start a conversation about abusive health-related practices in your community. This actually works pretty well, especially if it's done implicitly. So Sally also talks about other dangers of vernacularization. One of my favorites is the opportunity cost of forsaking a tool for mobilizing the weak. This is paraphrasing, but Sally at one point says, the downtrodden peoples, especially peoples that are minorities or stigmatized in a dominant culture that oppresses them, are amazed and gratified when they hear that there are people in New York and London and Geneva that care about the fact they're abused, and also have like a whole worldview that they've thought up that explains why them being abused is related to every bad thing that's going on in the world. And they say, wow, I want to sign up for this. You don't want to throw that away too quickly for watered down vernacularization. On the other hand, when we think about the human rights movement's own appeals to its great successes in history, the anti-slavery movement, Martin Luther King, they often are talking about movements that resonate strongly with the values of the majority groups in society, even while they also identify some connection to an oppressed group in society. And so I think there's, people should keep in mind that way of squaring this circle. Now, there's another kind of vernacularization. It's actually vernacularization in reverse, which I don't remember if Sally talks about this, but the problem is the pseudo-universalism of human rights discourse, which is turned on its head to justify rights abusive behavior. And I have a couple of examples of what I'm thinking about here. One is Daniel Goldstein's book Outlawed, which talks about vigilantism in urban areas in Bolivia, where local vigilante committees are angry at young men who prey on their community with robbery and violence, and they demand the right to protect their community by stringing up these people who threaten the human rights of people in their community. In fact, he describes the debates and fights between the police and the vigilantes as to which group has the right to execute these bad guys. So the other example is Rachel Wall's book, Just Violence, where she looks at torture in police departments in India by Indian police officers who have had human rights training. And she went and interviewed people, and they acknowledged torturing people that they had incarcerated in their police facilities, and they said, well, we did it because of the defense of human rights of our community. We had to protect the community from these people, and because the courts are too slow and incompetent, we knew that wouldn't do it, so we had to torture them to punish and deter them. So this is not vernacularization, but it's like some topsy-turvy opposite of vernacularization. So I have just one more point. I'm not sure if I have another couple of minutes to do it. And this is the question of how vernacularization relates to the concept that's more common in political science called localization. This is most prominently written about by Amitav Acharya. He writes about norms of sovereignty as articulated in the Bandung non-aligned movement, or as articulated in ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, where they're in dialogue with the concept of sovereignty as it's propounded at the global level by, you know, the advanced, powerful countries, but they have their own take on what this means. And so in that context, Acharya is talking about brokers in the culture that is not at the center of the global system of propounding norms, but in the periphery. Sally talks about intermediaries, which has some overlap with what Acharya is talking about. But Sally's intermediaries, if I remember correctly, tend to be more human rights or humanitarian-oriented professionals who can talk globally and locally, whereas Acharya's brokers are professional politicians who are trying to gain power and influence and authority in their local region by drawing on the mojo of international norms with the promise to their people that this will help them plug into wealth, modernity, and global opportunities. And the brokers engage in this through what, you know, he calls multivocality, what we could call talking out of both sides of your mouth to different audiences locally and globally. But so a lot of Sally's vernacularization is what I would call translation of global norms into some local idiom, whereas Acharya is adamant that this is a two-way street, that the brokers are creating not just new language, but new content, which projects back onto the international, like, norms central, and that the point about feedback to the global level is central. Now, I don't want to imply that this is necessarily a good thing. One of the most prominent books in my field of international relations and political science that talks about brokerage and multivocality uses it to explain how Otto von Bismarck managed to forge together a conservative alliance between German nationalists and German liberals, and also to convince French liberal nationalists to not oppose his military expansionism on principled grounds, at the same time that he convinced the Tsar not to oppose it on legitimist monarchical grounds. So we live in a time when this kind of localization and multivocality is, you know, with us in our own country. You know, Donald Trump is a great multivocal ventriloquist. So I'm not saying that this necessarily is a good thing, but I think that, like vernacularization, localization is also indispensable and dangerous. Thank you.
Through very good or very bad time management, we actually have time left over. This panel obviously is much less packed than any of the others, and they are a privileged elite. So we have time for comments or questions if anyone would want to raise any issues. We don't. Yeah? Yeah, it might be a good idea to use the microphone.
Hi,
since
I'm
we're recording
Setha
it.
Lowe. I'm a colleague from the Graduate Center, and I don't know if this is appropriate or not, but I wanted to ask, I'm just entering the world that all of you live in, which is the UN world and the one of sustainable development goals in the area of public space and the new urban agenda. So, and I'm facing everything all of you are facing, including being asked to help measure public space, of course, and for its beneficial benefits. Sally knows this. But my question is, and I think an appropriate question to Meg would be, what advice would you give me?
Don't do it.
No, I mean, let's say I'm committed to public space like you are to AIDS, and that I think it's important.
Yeah, thanks. I think it's a really important question. And I first encountered Sally's work through one of her former graduate students, Carol Wong, and I read some of her work on indicators before I went to work at the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria as their first senior human rights advisor. And the first task I had there was, you need to design an indicator on human rights for 140 countries, HIV, TB, and malaria. And so that was a challenge. I wasn't sure if it was helpful to have read Sally's work before doing that or made it less possible. But one of the things that I found helpful was a piece of advice that someone gave me, which was to create an indicator that is a lever that you can use to move the kind of change that you want to see, because they're communicative signs, but they're also, as Sally has written, you're shining a light on something that is creating a priority. And so try to construct that indicator or that data gathering initiative in such a way that it leverages initiatives that you're trying to push forward.
And one that others can use as well.
Exactly, yeah. It creates space for advocacy, I think. You know, of the kind of that Cesar was talking about.
Yeah, so Cesar is fine. I think that's an important part of the conversation.
Anyone else for Jack or Cesar or Meg?
Yeah, other.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's true. Anyone want to? We're also happy to break early for lunch, which I'm sure will be.
Questions for each other? The whole group want to talk about the difference of different kinds of metaphors and different kinds of images that you're recruiting for your discussions, whether they be visual or literary or quantification. I mean, you're all using different vehicles for mounting your critique of what you're talking about. And I'm curious about all of you listening to each other, what you think of this mobilization of the visual and other kinds of data into the communication and also critique of the indicators or the underlying knowledge base on which they're being constructed.
I have a question for Jack, and that is, why should we care? Constitutionalism, lists of rights, formally defined statutes really only matter to people like us. Elites, lawyers, people at the UN, and they always have to be packaged and sold. And so that packaging and selling is an act of populist engagement in some way. And if it generates buy-in, if it generates an endorsement, then why should we care how it's done? And I guess my question would be, what would be the next stage of showing how not simply the ideas were reworked, but the ideas were reworked and then had the succession of bad consequences?
So the human rights advocacy movement cares a lot about how it's done. The person who did the most over the last 100 years to reduce child labor was Deng Xiaoping. He did not use it using rights modalities at all. He did it by jump-starting the Chinese economy and improving obligatory education in China. So why do we even need to care about human rights modality if we can accomplish the same goals that the human rights movement has, doing just whatever works? And I think there's from time to time an argument for doing whatever works. However, I think there's an argument for doing it the right way, which is the human rights way. So societies that are at a very high level of human rights, including the standard civil rights, are the only ones that have developed economically past the middle income trap, except for oil states and Singapore, which are kind of excrescences on the liberal international economic order. And countries with high levels of human rights don't fight wars with each other and are less likely to have civil wars. And countries with human rights are the most functional countries, and they're countries that have what everyone wants around the globe, which is development. And I think that's not an accident, and I think that that's a reason to try to instantiate rights wherever people are willing to sign up for that program.
Can I add something to that? I wanted to add something to that based on mostly my experience as practitioner of human rights as opposed to researcher. In many of the communities that I've worked with for this book and this project, one of the striking things for me, findings, personal and scientific findings, is that it's non-lawyers at the grassroots level who believe most about the power of law and those rules. They believe in that much more than I do, because I developed the cynicism that you get in law schools, in elite institutions that they haven't had a chance or cannot afford to have. So I found myself being pushed to use more actively those legal instruments by some of the indigenous leaders that have led these struggles, but not in a mechanistic way, and in ways in line with what I argued in my presentation, in ways that actively oftentimes reshape the meaning of those norms. So again, this specific institution of FPIC, Free, Prior, and Informed Consultation, has been actively mobilized, and once and again, one litigation after another, one People's Forum for Indigenous People here in New York after another, in ways that are not passive, in ways that entail transformation, reshaping, through the use of the language and the institutions of international law and constitutional law. And my one fear about the skepticism or even the cynicism that I sense, by the way, it's mostly a U.S. thing, right? That wouldn't fly in many other venues around the world. So I think it would be a mistake to export American exceptionalism with regards to human rights at a moment in which we most need human rights, and a moment in which actually, and as those of you who know something about my internal squabbles with human rights activists, I am not defending the status quo in human rights. I think that organizations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty and all the NGOs that have been too much focused on naming and shaming and on the regular and traditional conventional strategies, we all need to realize that the world has changed, that visuals, that storytelling, that many other forms of persuasion need to be added to the toolkit if we have any chance of standing against the populist authoritarians of the world. But just as human rights may be seen in some quarters as an elite project, getting rid of it is also an elite project. It's also kind of an unilateral decision to forget about it, done also in elite quarters.
Yeah. Maybe-
Just one brief gloss on that. I wonder also, you said it's American exceptionalism, the constant pushback and so on, but in academic circles, it's interesting to compare the number of presentations, papers and so on, which are, this is very simplistic, I know, positive as opposed to negative. In other words, if you're giving an academic paper, the starting assumption seems to be, I'm going to critique and show the shortcomings and weaknesses of this enterprise. I'm not going to try to explain why it's done so much. Beth Simmons stands as a major disgrace to the academic community in this regard, because it was a determined effort to demonstrate impact and to shine the light on some of the positive stuff. But if one were to do a study of the sort of academic analyses that are being produced these days, those that are most valued, that are most talked about, and I think younger people going into the field would be pushed to say, well, I've got to show why this enterprise is flawed in some way that is important. Privileged question from Paul Merry.
Can I get in the line?
From what I've gathered from the presentation, I'm not an academic. I'm 19 years at law. I'm a civil rights lawyer. I try to enforce some of these laws and some of the statutory systems that embody human rights, as we've been discussing this morning. And from what I gather this morning, there's a lot of attention is paid to how these rights are developed and articulated, which of course we can't do without. But I'm curious if there's a lot of study or investment being put into implementation, and this is what I think what Cesar may have been alluding to a little bit, is there a study going into how these rights, once articulated, once refined, and are actually being implemented or say maybe enforced or somehow brought down to the ground in societies throughout the world.
Meg, why don't you start?
Well, actually, I think what I was going to say might somewhat speak to that, because I think what I really appreciated, Cesar, about your presentation just now is your emphasis on the exporting of norms from the global south, or whatever phrase we're using this week, because I know global south is on its way out. But I think the way in which human rights norms are innovated and traveling is sometimes very far from whatever is being thought of and constructed in the US or in Geneva. And so one of the examples that jumps to my mind is the work of a human rights group in Kenya that I've worked a lot with called KALIN, that filed a lawsuit to stop the imprisonment of TB patients who defaulted on their treatment, because they were being put in prison, which is like the most ridiculous thing you want to do with someone who's active TB infection. And so they successfully managed to overturn this law and this practice in Kenya, which I thought was like really great grassroots lawyering. And then started being asked by people in Peru if they could go to Peru and start talking to people in Peru about how to change the law there. So I think this is really interesting. There's a lot of these kinds of examples in HIV and maybe also in work on climate and other areas too, of where you see these norms being innovated and traveling in ways that don't go through Geneva or the US or the global north. And so I think that's, when we think about the mapping of human rights and the tactics that we use, I think we have to think about some of the larger mapping that kind of decenters the global north a little bit.
We have to stop that sort of avoidance of the US and Geneva.
Yeah, briefly on the issue of implementation, yes, this is exactly what many of us are trying to do, looking at what happens after either the moment of creation of standards, like many of the scholars in the vernacularization debate. Some others have tried to look at the post with regards to judicial activism and strategic litigation. What happens after you get a favorable ruling from a court, and that's been a pretty vibrant enterprise, at least in socio-legal studies, with regards to issues like socioeconomic rights litigation, advocacy, and the good thing about that, and this has everything to do with the type of work that Sally has done over the years and has led in the Law and Society community, is that the picture of implementation offers much more nuanced understanding of what the law actually is than what you can get from law on the books. But this is not anything new. It's just that there is a much more vibrant and much more inclusive and globalized agenda of looking at how this plays out in many different countries around the world. Yeah, that's all I say.
There's quite a lot of work nowadays and over the last, say, 15 years in political science where people have systematically tried to look at the factors that lead to compliance with human rights obligations, both from the standpoint of just environmental factors that may affect that, like whether there's war or peace, or the per capita income of the country, or whether women have income outside the home. But they've also, either the human rights organizations or the humanitarian organizations themselves doing program analysis, or social scientists using that data and doing surveys, have looked at what kinds of tactics of implementation have been effective. And, you know, sometimes it's, you know, hard to tell what's causing what, because after all, it's social science. It's not real science. But people are definitely working on the problem, and I think making headway, and that there's enough known about what works in what circumstances and what doesn't, that there's plenty of grist there for people who want to dive into those research findings and try to draw inferences for, okay, how should we adjust our implementation strategies?
So, Sally, I think I can ask you later if you think of yourself as an unreal scientist.
Fake scientist.
Yeah. I think, well, all right, very brief. Yeah, then we should break in a minute.
It'll be a brief, it's a kind of a question comment. I think one of the things that's most exciting for me today is to see kind of the diversity of folks we have in the room in terms of crossing national boundaries, disciplinary boundaries, practitioners and scholars. So I think one of my, making me reflect on kind of what about Sally's work kind of is able to traverse those kind of different boundaries in a way that I think very little work is. I'm not a political scientist. I'm happy to see the political scientists here. And I think for me, just to have it broken up, for me, the work speaks to both kind of structures of power and also kind of the agency of the vernacularizers of the social movements in a way that I think is pretty rare. And I'd love to hear, I feel privileged to be in the room with people who are
That's a very helpful comment, but I'm going to give Sally the last word before lunch.
Well, I know that Janice Gallagher, who just spoke, has been working on strategic litigation in Mexico and Colombia, and I wanted her to talk about that, which she didn't. But I think it's, one of the interesting questions that's come up from this panel so far is why the critique of human rights has come from the countries which, as you say, have human rights, but don't actually think it applies to them. And the support for it is coming from, in some ways, vulnerable populations, of which you've heard several cases of protests, who may not believe that this is an incredibly effective system, but we often find relatively vulnerable populations turning to law, even though the law is not necessarily on their side, but it may be the only kind of resource that's available to them. And we see this in indigenous communities and other places, which then leads to the question about why do we have critics and what is their political position who say that this system doesn't work at all? Where are they located, and do they perhaps want to stop this kind of grassroots mobilization of human rights? The comments that I only looked at the top down and then not the bottom up part of human rights activism is certainly something that I fully recognize. And you can't do everything in every book you write. And I'm very grateful to everybody who has over the years pointed out that it goes both ways. And I think it's really important, and I appreciate the work that you all have done to make that clear. So thank you all. It's been a great series of papers so far, and I hope you all will stay for the wonderful ones this afternoon.
Thanks, Sally. So we'll meet again at 2:00. There's a meeting for speakers in the meantime, but yeah, resume at 2:00.
So I'm